this.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, Knez, you were nominated for an Emmy. Was that insane, first of all?
I kind of was. I mean, this unit does really well with stuff because we can tell in a longer form. So that's always kind of a good thing. But yeah, it was kind of I was on vacation the day the nominations came in. So it was a nice bunch of text messages from friends because I didn't even know they were coming out.
Did you, how long have you been a producer with Nightline?
I've been working with Nightline since last summer. So not quite a year and a half.
Okay, well, of course, you were nominated for an Emmy for your work on a two-part segment called Putin's Russia. Can you tell us what you were trying to show? What was the segment generally about? What were you trying to show? What was your mission statement?
I was actually attached to it I think the same week they sent Dan out to Russia. Dan and one of the producers from here in New York, his name is Bartley Price. They sent them out, and I was attached to it like the same week they had left. So they had originally gone and planned to spend a lot of time with Navalny and do a lot of behind the scenes and as much as they could on the big protest that Navalny had planned in one city for Putin's birthday. And then they were kind of just see what else they could find while they were on the ground. All of that got shaken up pretty quickly, though, because the day they hit the ground in Russia was the day Navalny was set to appear in court and then subsequently sent to jail.
Well, your report spent a lot of time focusing on the presidential race in Russia. And the presidential race, bizarre as it is here in America, bears no resemblance to how bizarre it is in Russia. How crazy was that presidential race?
I mean, it was one of the only times we've actually considered going back and trying to see if there was anything else we could do. But by then, they had already basically told Navalny that he wasn't allowed to run. So we didn't end up going back to Russia for it. But it's insane there. I mean, any political opponent to Putin is generally kind of either run out of town, or in some cases, there were portions of the story that we couldn't report due to standard stuff where people are paid off or they find blackmail information on them and suddenly they stop being a critic and start being a supporter very inexplicably.
So you're saying that the major opponent of Vladimir Putin in the presidential race wasn't allowed to run?
No, he was not allowed to run because they had, and in order to, Navalny's been arrested a bunch of times. And there was a time, and I think he's still technically fighting all the charges, but there was a time he was taken in, I think a few years back, where they charged him, it had to do with finances and fraud. And the courts found him guilty, which makes him ineligible to run. He's, of course, been fighting that conviction ever since, but those are the grounds they use. He appealed it to try and say, I should be allowed to be on the ballot. And they wouldn't let him run. So no, he wasn't on the ballot.
I think the craziest thing I saw in that story regarding him was when a pro-Putin protester shot paint in his face. And his entire face was blue for however long?
Yeah, it was like green or blue. I think they've done it a couple times. And I actually think that it's a toxin of some kind. So if he'd had enough in his face, it could have blinded him.
Reflecting on what you showed, Knez, what do you think the state of democracy is in Russia right now?
I don't think there really is an active democracy in Russia right now. I don't think it's necessarily an expectation that they should probably immediately have one either. I mean, you're talking about a country that is so many generations old and it's never been a democracy. So you're not talking about a country that was like ours that was founded on the idea. You're talking about a country that's battling to try and become. We did have one of our big producers on the ground is a native Russian. He was one of our camera guys. And we sat down with him and did debriefs that you don't actually get to see in the piece where he talks about how things have changed in the time since both before Putin came into power and since Putin came into power, and just the things that are different all the way around in Russia, like access to commercials and stuff like that. So it's just, things are changing, but they're not changing fast enough for a lot of people.
When you covered the protests in your story, just me personally, I felt strangely heartened by them. I was watching them in your story. I thought to myself, it's pretty nasty. They have to put up with, harassment and plainclothes officers and that weird biker gang and stuff like that. But these are people willing to stand up to one of those brutal authoritarians on the planet. When you were producing this piece, when you were editing it, when you were looking at it, what was your reaction to all that? Was that your reaction, that you were heartened? Were you filled with despair for these people? What was your reaction?
I think it was probably a little bit of both, partially because we were also getting the feedback from our field team. So their impressions, and specifically Dan, as we were talking, what we may not have been super clear about is that the protesters are almost uniformly extremely young. They're all, whether it's, teenagers or kids in college, there's not a huge portion of the population that represents anybody older than that. Whether it's because they like where things are, if they account for the 88% approval rating that Putin has in Russia, or if they are just not willing to go out and risk it. This was one of the few, there are big protests like this, and they tend to end with tons and tons of arrests. This was one of the few that didn't. It ended actually quite painless. There weren't that many arrests at the end of this one. So we were we were a little bit back and forth when it came to what do you feel for these guys? I mean, they're doing it. They're risking something to go out there because they could end up being arrested. They could end up being thrown in jail, and that will follow them. And you saw, I think, in some of the footage, you saw that the cops run around with video cameras so that they can videotape the protesters and then know who to look for in the future. Or know who to target. At least that's what the protesters tell us they're doing.
Did you just say that Vladimir Putin has an 88% approval rating?
It's nearly 90%. It's huge.
Is that real, or is that?
I think the consensus is that it's pretty real. I mean, our team. I mean, as much as you can probably gauge any of that, our team on the ground found a lot of people who do like him. I mean, they found a lot of young people who don't, but they found a lot of people who do like him.
I'm certain that.
Wait, just for a heads up, I am trying to link in on my phone to see if that camera actually works.
All right, that's fine. Can you still hear me okay?
Yeah, I'm just trying to do both.
Yeah, I'm certain that Putin is relatively popular in Russia, but 9 out of 10, was that the reaction you sensed, 9 out of 10 people? I mean, Saddam Hussein got reelected with 99% of the vote, but obviously he wasn't popular with 99% of Iraq.
That's true. Oh, I think I booted myself. Hang on.
Seriously, to take those numbers. I am shocked by them, though.
Do young people vote in Russia, or is it predominantly the older hard lines that remember World War II?
Oh, there you are. Oh, hi.
Hello.
I
can actually figure out how it works now.
So, do young people
Yes,
vote?
young people can vote, yeah. I think, again, you have to take it into the context of the history of Russia and the fact that it was a dynasty for so long, run by royalty, run by one family. I think there's an appeal to that you get from a consistent president, that we got a lot of feedback from people on when you were just talking to the people that you would meet, as opposed to the activists that we spent time with. But their contention is that the number isn't quite that high, but they do acknowledge that it is a big uphill battle.
Yeah. So from your piece, I had so much fun watching it because you covered so much ground. Relative to what we're talking about today, we got to talk about the troll farm. What's a troll farm? And first of all, what is a troll farm? Can you tell us about that? What is that?
The troll factory was actually kind of something they lucked into. They knew that it was there, and ABC has done a big job of following that in recent years, especially since the election meddling came out. So they knew where it would be. They knew what they wanted to pursue, but they really didn't have any set in stone plans to go after it. They went out to dinner. They just happened to be in the right area, and they thought, let's swing by. So that was kind of on a lark that they went ahead and just tried to see if they could walk in and get anybody's attention. And they were very quickly kicked out. Ludmila Savchuk, who is the former troll that we talked to, has an established relationship again with ABC. We've talked to her in the past. Our investigative unit has spent time with her and gotten videos that she and some of her friends took. She was a journalist, an investigative journalist who took an assignment inside the Troll Factory to find out how much money they made, what it is that they were doing. She was assigned to what they call the Russia side of social media. So their internet interference isn't just to the United States, it's worldwide, and it's even within their own country. So a troll factory is designed to basically, I'm trying to think of the easiest way to say it. They basically put out social content, pro things that they like and anti things that they don't. And the company, she said, sets the priority list for the day.
That was on our end.
Oh, okay.
So let me ask you about that, because we got a lot of reporting in 2016 and 17 about the Russian trolling of social media, particularly Twitter. And the impression that I was given over and over when I was reading these stories is that this is a highly sophisticated operation run by the Russian government. But in the clips you guys showed online, it just looked like a bunch of dudes in a warehouse. It did not look, it looked really ramshackle.
It's a very established business, I think, for them. They, it's in a really nice office building. They own, I think every floor of it is where they operate. They say their computers were good. Like, I mean, it's set up like it's an office building. It's set up like it's a job that you go to an office to do. You spend 8 hours and you go home.
It did look like a bunch of people playing Fortnite. Like, it did not look like, I guess, I don't know, in my head, I guess I had it like as the dungeons of hell in my head, but it just looks like like you said, an office building. It looks something.
It's like a day job is how it's presented to people, and it pays fairly well. So people do it. And they do have they have to create a bunch of personalities on Facebook, on Twitter, anywhere they can. And then the idea is that they go in, they make posts, they respond to posts as those people. So Ludmila was telling us she spelled out a few of her personalities that she had to play. And like I said, her unit was focused on Russia. So it was actually inside of Russia talking to Russians. We had clips from another guy who was actually part of the US unit, what they had to target. But even Ludmila said when she's talking to a Russian audience, she's supposed to be talking about the United States. She's supposed to be talking about elections and stuff like that.
I guess I just expected it to look like the NSA headquarters, like something extremely highly corporate. But I mean, they were ushered out quickly, but they didn't just walk in. They just walked in, and they were eventually ushered. They got in. I
mean, the whole idea is that they're supposed to be legit business that people don't pay attention to, or that they just don't know is there. Since Ludmila left, she's led a couple protests right outside the door, but it was kind of just her and a friend. It wasn't very much to it.
I didn't pick this up from your story. Is that concealed? Is that like a sign outside saying this is where the troll factory is?
No, it literally just looks like a building. It's just an office building. And you see, I think we show a couple exterior shots at the very beginning of the top of the hour, but that's about it.
All right. Yeah. I'd like to, if it's okay with you, Knez, I'd like to open the floor. If anybody has any questions or comments they'd like to make towards you about your piece or about anything you may know about
no problem.
Russia under Vladimir Putin. Anybody have any comments or questions? William.
You can hear me okay?
Yes. Can you hear him okay?
Yeah, I can hear you just fine.
Someone like Mikhail Hodorkovsky, who used to be in charge of Yukos Oil, he fled the country after he was imprisoned in Siberia. Should people like that be worried about more attacks like what happened in England, wasn't it?
Yeah, like Russia had killed an English spy or
the
something.
The poisoning stuff.
Because he was pretty high up within the oligarchs.
Well, I mean, it was one of the things we couldn't include, but we interviewed Alexander Lebedev, who isn't anymore, I think, but was an oligarch at one point and had a huge amount of power. I mean, he made his money in the newspaper business, both there and in the UK, and had spent time in both places. And he is one who was supposedly taken down by blackmail. they released videos of him with girls in hotel rooms. And then he very quickly switched his allegiance to be very, very pro-Putin. So as far as the poisonings are concerned, I don't know. I mean, look what's going on in Turkey right now. The reach of any one government who doesn't like critics is probably pretty far. But
something about that. Does the Turkey like taking that journalist and basically just brutally murdering him, and then Saudi Arabia threatening if we get involved, then Russia will bring a base to Saudi Arabia. Like, should we be worried about a Russian aggression?
Oh, I think everybody should be worried about Russian aggression because they haven't shown any pullback. I mean, there's still rotten stuff happening in the Ukraine, and there's still comment back and forth despite what Putin says that they don't interfere in anything. There's still evidence that they're doing it now, heading into the midterms and heading into 2020.
Is it Cold War hangover or is it something new?
I think it probably depends on who you asked. I don't know if I have a good answer to that one.
Okay. Knez, were your reporters followed?
Not that we're aware of, I don't think. And they did run around to and hung out with people who are very anti-government.
Yeah, that's always been my impression, is that Russia tracks everybody of substance or everybody of any significance whatsoever. And they will follow you. They'll bug everything in your room and they'll follow you and they'll videotape everything. That they felt like they were largely free of government surveillance stuff.
Yeah, I don't think they felt like they were being tailed or anything like that at all.
Comments about Russia for Knez Walker.
I'm sorry, say again.
I was just rephrasing, asking if anybody had questions. We got a question for you, man.
What do you think about Putin? Do you like him, or do you think he needs to step down?
No, he's a total bully. I mean, I think all the evidence is clear. He takes advantage of propaganda. It's a power-hungry kind of thing. Especially, I think the really heinous stuff is actually in the second part of the report, which I think in hindsight, we'd all talked about trying to make its own piece, which I wish, kind of wish we could have done, which was take the aid stuff. I mean, that's just again, there was so much that was shot in Russia that we couldn't even include in our report. We just didn't have the time. But that was kind of where you see how real people are involved. And that's all happening in a district that's governed by a guy who's anti-Putin. But the effects of it are still everywhere, I mean, there's underrepresented, undertreated, poor treatment of what AIDS is in that country. I mean, they have a rate of growth for HIV and AIDS that is on par with developing countries, underdeveloped countries.
I was going to ask why you had included reporting about the AIDS epidemic in Russia. Are you saying it's part of that report because...
Advocates would say it's largely attributable to Putin's government because they're not educating, they won't fund for it. One of the women who runs one of those HIV centers that helps mothers and children who are infected with the disease has been labeled what did she call it? It was like a suspicious person. She was labeled basically a spy because she pushed the government for more resources.
Are you suggesting that it's incompetence that's leading to this epidemic, or it's maliciousness?
A lot of Putin's backing and power comes from religion and the church. And so he's not going to try and piss off the church. So a lot of the government policies are try to stay in line with that far right Christian side.
Oh, so like the Pussycat Dolls, or not the Pussycat Dolls, the
Riot.
Yeah.
Dr. Lynch.
I was going to say, in the 90s, I remember that a significant amount of the AIDS epidemic at that time was tied to drug abuse and rampant drug abuse combined with the alcoholism and promiscuity, etc. Is there no longer a pandemic of drug abuse?
Oh no, there is that too. Yeah, it's not the only thing. Unsafe sex and stuff like that is the guy that we talked to. I think if you we go back, he shows us very quickly how on his phone, he was a drug addict, how on his phone he could arrange a drop-off. There's an app for that. But he acknowledges that the way he got it was actually after using a bunch of drugs, he had unprotected sex with a woman. And they do those parking lot tests that we show, and he came up positive.
I'll be honest with you, this is a bleak picture of Russia. Is life in Russia bleak?
I think it depends on who you talk to. We did a huge section out in the Siberian villages where people are very happy. I mean, no, I think that's probably not a bleak place, but it depends on who you are. If you're gay in Russia, that's risky. You know, if you have HIV in Russia, your life expectancy isn't particularly long.
There's a segment of the country down south that's very Muslim too. I forget what it's called. Chechnya, I believe.
Yeah, Chechnya.
But, you know,
I mean, there's been so much violence there over the last 20, 25 years.
Did you get, it doesn't, I don't know, is it a third world country in living conditions? I mean, it didn't seem like that watching it.
No.
It seemed like
It's a modern, beautiful, I mean, the further you get out into Siberia, I mean, the bulk of the population lives in the eastern part of the country. So, I mean, we did Moscow, they did St. Petersburg, and then they went out to Ekaterinburg, which is Siberia, but it's still the eastern section of Siberia. I mean, this is a country that straddles, like 9 or 10 time zones. It's huge. But when he went out into Siberia, life there is a little bit different, and the village that we visited was pretty run down and ramshackle. But no, I mean, the rest of the country is, I mean, I think you could talk to anybody who's visited Russia. It's beautiful, absolutely gorgeous, very metropolitan, big city living in many places.
I have a quick question. Do you guys worry about brain drain in Russia at all? With major people, like I said, like Hordikovsky and those people that are really powerful people who made a lot of money after the fall of the Soviet Union. Are you worried about more of them fleeing and taking that entrepreneurial spirit away from Russia?
You know, I don't know. I haven't seen enough reporting on it to know whether or not it's a real thing. I mean, they've been worried about stuff like that since, the Cold War.
And things.
So whether brain drain is a real phenomenon happening in Russia, I really am not sure.
Okay.
Knez, in the time you reported on Russia, the 10 days there, is there stuff that still sticks out to you that you still carry with you? What was one of the things that you produced at least, that really left a major impact on you?
For me, it was the kids. It was the moms and the kids with AIDS. I'll never shake that. Like, that'll just be like, because talking, every time we would log the interviews, we would watch the interviews, we would hear how people talked about it, with the exception of the woman who ran the center and one of the very young men who was probably infected at birth, like his mom was positive. It's like talking to people during the 1980s, like when you read interviews or you see videos of people in the United States with AIDS in the 1980s. That's what that felt like. It felt like this is this massively developed first world country that is treating its people in a way that is like, 30, almost 40 years old now. Like, just their approach to it was so backwards. And those are real people. Those are real lives.
Have you heard back from the Russian government itself?
No, and our report was geo-blocked to Russia to protect identities, to protect the people who talk to us. So our report was not available in Russia.
Okay, that's great. I just want to clarify, although you were nominated.
But we'd have like our bureau guys are still out there. So the bureau guys are stationed out there. I mean, it's where they work. They work out of Moscow.
Does anybody have any comments, questions for Knez?
I actually have a question. So you said that the approval rating is 89% in Russia. Now, and as Mr. Crocker said that maybe those aren't necessarily real, but then whenever he was asking about if the country is kind of bleak to live in, it seemed like the people who had an issue were those who were kind of gay or had HIV. But then again, almost all Americans say that he's horrible and everything's bad. So I'm kind of wondering why else they approve of him other than his bloodline.
I think in truth, there are a lot of people who aren't adversely impacted by his policies. You know what I'm saying? It's
Like,
Russia has seen a lot of improvements, like our field producer Max was talking about. A lot of things have changed since he was young. There are access to Western chains. There are, stores and retailers, and access in the country is different than it used to be. It doesn't feel as restricted. But with that ability to look at the rest of the world, very young people are looking at it and going, this isn't really freedom. There's more to it than that. So I don't know.
Okay.
I mean, some presidents in the United States have gotten extremely high approval ratings despite having some really bad stuff on their records.
well, but even citizens of the U.S. are really opinionated, and I know that freedom isn't as grand in Russia, but at the same time, I wonder if those, like the citizens of Russia, believe that, like the ones impacted with HIV, if they believe that if that's correlated with Putin's policies.
It depends. Some of them did and some of them didn't.
Okay.
In truth, some of them bought into the ad campaigns around the country, which were things like, it was kind of like, this is all about you, you made bad choices. And there are some of them that parroted those lines back to us. And like, because her husband was infected and somehow that was her responsibility and it was her fault that she ended up HIV positive. And so did her baby.
Knez Walker, thank you so much for giving us a half hour of your time. That was so great.
No problem.
I reserve the right to yell at you again if we'd like.
No problem.
But thank you so much.
All right. Have a good night, guys.
You too. All right.